Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by a return guest, Dr. Peter Adamson. He is professor of philosophy and the host of the weekly podcast, History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. I will be leaving a link to our first interview, which was about the pre-Socratic philosophers, in the description down below. And today we're talking about his book, Heirs of Avicenna, Philosophy in the Islamic East, 12th, 13th century. So, Dr. Adamson, welcome back to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back.
So, since we're going to talk here about the Heirs of Avicenna and philosophy in the what they call the Islamic East in the 12th and 13th centuries, let me start by asking you first about Avicenna himself. So who was Avicenna?
Right. Okay. So Avicenna, who I these days actually prefer to call Ibn Sina. So when we first started doing this project, my colleagues and I who put the books together, I was still kind of in the habit of using the English name, which is based on the Latin name, Avicenna. But nowadays I sort of gravitated towards calling him Ibn Sina, which is his real name. But whatever you call him, he lived in Central Asia. So he's from right on the border of modern-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. And he lived from the 10th into the 11th century. So he died in 1037 CE. And he's the most important philosopher of the Islamic world. It's hard to kind of capture his achievement in just a few sentences, but I'll try. So one way to think about what happened is that in around the 8th, 9th, early 10th century, there was an effort to translate a massive amount of Greek science and philosophy into Arabic. So by the middle of the 10th century, you have philosophers like, for example, al-Farabi, who's quite well known, working in Iraq and Syria, who was able to read, for example, pretty much all the same Aristotle that we can read, but in Arabic translation, and was also aware of other Greek sources like Neoplatonism and so on. Even knew something about Plato, although his access to Plato would have been a lot less good than his access to Aristotle. And Farabi is typical of what happens in the first couple of centuries after that translation movement, which is that philosophers who are writing in Arabic, and by the way, they might be Christians as well as Muslims. So Farabi was a Muslim, but a lot of these people are Christians who are doing this in Arabic. They are commenting on Aristotle. They're writing treatises of their own, independent treatises where they reflect on the Greek heritage, maybe combine it with ideas from Islam or Christianity or even Judaism. And so you have this kind of multi-religious effort to come to grips with and build upon Greek philosophical heritage. Then Ibn Sina comes along and he does the same thing in effect, except that he does it much more innovatively, boldly, provocatively, and also this is kind of a long story, but he weaves in a lot of ideas and problems from the Islamic theological tradition. We might come back to that later. So the result is that instead of getting someone who's just kind of explaining Aristotle to you or using Aristotle's ideas, but kind of building on them in a incremental way, he blows Greek philosophy out of the water and it sort of puts it back, the pieces back together into a new system with his own terminology, his own set of philosophical problems, his own even way of arranging the curriculum of philosophical and scientific studies. And he effectively replaces Aristotle as the philosopher to whom everyone wants to respond. Now, this would get more into the actual book that we produced, but one thing that's worth knowing is that out in the Islamic West, so in Spain, you have figures like especially Averroes or Ibn Rushd, who are still commenting on Aristotle. But that's kind of that's actually very important historically because his commentaries on Aristotle were translated into Latin and used a lot in Latin scholasticism. But in the area that we're focusing on, the Islamic East, which is the main heartlands of the Islamic world, it's really Ibn Sina who's of interest to everybody.
Right. And of course, it would be, I guess, hard for you to probably even summarize it, but what were Avicenna's main contributions to philosophy? I mean, just in general terms.
Right. Okay. Well, so you're right. It's difficult, in part because he innovates in pretty much every area that he discusses. Probably the only areas where he's not really moving the conversation ahead massively would be ethics and political philosophy. Even there, he has interesting things to say, but he has interesting things to say in the way that some of his other contemporaries do, I would say. But on every other area of philosophy, he's massively new. Even if he is always thinking about Aristotle and Greek philosophy as well as Islamic theology or kalam. So he's always thinking about these sources, but his new system is really something new. Maybe the three things that would be worth highlighting. First of all, logic. So in logic, he has a new way of thinking about how logic fits together, which incorporates and significantly expands Aristotelian logic. So later works on logic, and as we might get on to talking about, they're really interested in logic in the period we're looking at. They write textbooks on logic that are clearly based on Avicenna's logic and not Aristotle's logic. Okay. No. And of course, this is logic, so the details are rather technical. I mean, I can go into them if you want, but they're not easy to understand and explain. But that's one thing. Another thing is theory of the soul. So something that's very famous is that he has this thought experiment, the flying man thought experiment. Yeah. The basic idea is you're supposed to imagine that God creates a human being floating in midair, and this human being has no way of using their senses at all. So he's blindfolded, and there's no noise, there's no smell, or there's nothing he can taste, right? And he's not touching anything because he's floating in midair, right? Mm-hmm. So the point of this just is that this is a person who has no sensory input at all. Like a sort of like a sensory deprivation tank, but even more extreme. In part because he's never had any sensory experiences before either. So he doesn't have any memory of ever having touched anything or smelled anything or seen anything. And so you might think, well, a person like that would just kind of be vacant or blank in their mind because they haven't had any input, right? But Avicenna says, no, this person would be aware of his own existence. So he'd be sort of able to think, oh, here I am, or something like that, right? He'd be aware of his own thoughts, maybe. And he says that this shows that the soul is separate from the body because he's unaware of his body, but he's aware of his self. So that means his body and his self are not identical. Okay, that's the flying man thought experiment. So that's a very famous thing that he does, and it makes self-awareness a really crucial part of later reflections on the nature of the soul and the self. There's more to his theory of soul than that, of course, but that's one of the main things that he does there. And then even more radical and new and interesting is what he does in metaphysics. And so, again, this is quite a long story, but what it kind of boils down to is that he puts the concept of existence at the center of his metaphysics. So instead of thinking about God as the cause of the motion of the universe, as Aristotle had done, he thinks of God as the source of existence for everything. And he makes this pivotal contrast between essence and existence, which we'll probably get on to talking about more. So the basic idea here is just that what something is won't tell you whether it exists. So like a triangle, what it is will tell you that it has three sides and that its internal angles are equal to 180 degrees. But there's nothing about triangle that guarantees that it exists, right? So existence turns out to be this kind of extrinsic feature of things that comes to them from the outside, and God gives it to them. And he thinks through that in lots of different ways, and that gives him a kind of way into metaphysics that's very different from Aristotle's metaphysics.
So would philosophy in the Islamic East, and of course we're going to get later on into some more of the main topics that were explored by Avicenna and his heirs in the Islamic East, but would philosophy in the Islamic East compare in any way to the scholastic tradition that we had in Europe?
Very much so. Yeah, in fact, something that I often say about this material that we've assembled for the Heirs of Avicenna books is that it's like Latin scholasticism in many ways, except that it's earlier, right? Because Latin scholasticism kind of gets going in the 13th century and keeps going actually all the way up into the 17th century or even longer. Whereas this kind of post-Avicennan, highly detailed engagement with Ibn Sina's ideas, lots of distinctions, lots of technical vocabulary, lots of arguments. So even things like there will be a question and then 7 different arguments on one side of the question and 12 arguments on the other side, just like in a scholastic Latin treatise that would have been written in the University of Paris in the 13th century. You find all that in the 12th century in Arabic. Mm-hmm. So, some of the things we'll probably get on to discussing also have thematic parallels in Latin scholastic philosophy. So these are very parallel traditions. Okay. The reasons for the parallels are complex. So it has something to do with the fact that in both contexts, you have educational institutions that give rise to that kind of writing. So you have like masters sitting with students, taking them through a difficult text, making lots of distinctions, getting them to master the vocabulary and the concepts. So that's one reason why there's so many parallels. But another reason is that in both contexts, Ibn Sina is the source, right? So the Latin scholastics are reading Avicenna, and my guys are reading Ibn Sina, and they're the same guy, right?
Yeah.
So that's another reason why you have so many parallels.
So to just provide a little bit more of historical and intellectual context here, in the book you mentioned that, quote, in the middle of the 11th century, the 2 predominant philosophical traditions in the Islamic world were falsafa and kalam. You've already mentioned kalam earlier a little bit, but what were these traditions about? And why do they matter to then contextualize the influence of Avicenna, and how his philosophy relates to these traditions?
Right. Okay. So falsafa, so Falsafa, if you were writing it out in English letters, falsafa is just an Arabic version of the Greek word philosophia, right? So it's the word philosophy. It's our word philosophy, but in Arabic, and it was used to refer to both philosophy and what we would call science. So it could include things like astronomy or physics, right? So it's that, but it very clearly indicates something that comes from the Greeks. And that's important that the word is a Greek word, right? Mm-hmm. So this would be, like I said before, al-Farabi, or earlier than him, al-Kindi, or there are some other philosophers too, which maybe would be confusing to name them all, but there's a whole bunch of philosophers who are doing this Greek-inspired kind of philosophy, and Ibn Sina is one of them. So something that we see happening is that because he replaces Aristotle as the main philosopher, in the later tradition, they start using the word falsafa to refer to Ibn Sina, right? So they know that Aristotle is also kind of behind it, right? And they will talk about Aristotle too occasionally. But if you see a reference to falsafa or the philosophers without further context in the later period, in the post-Avicennan period, it's always a reference either to Ibn Sina or to Ibn Sina and people who agree with him. Okay. Yeah. So that's falsafa. Kalam is a bit more complicated. So kalam is a word that we use and was already used then for a theological tradition that begins around the same time as the translation movement, actually. So it gets going in the 8th, 9th century. And this is a tradition of people using rational arguments to defend certain readings of the Quran and Islamic theology generally. So they will argue about things like the status of divine attributes, whether or not humans have free will, what are the conditions of moral responsibility, what are bodies made of? Are they made of atoms? They usually say yes. So one difference, like a real sign of the difference between falsafa and kalam, is that the mutakallimun, so people who do kalam are called mutakallimun, right? That means theologians, and they are they very strongly tend to endorse atomism. So they think that created things are these indivisible substances to which God associates various properties, like motion or rest, for example. So they think that, and the philosophers, the people who are inspired by Greek philosophy, like Aristotle, they deny that and they reject atomism, which is true of Ibn Sina as well. I mean, traditionally people have thought, well, there's theology and they're very worried about the Quran and whatever. And there's the philosophers who are reading Aristotle. But nowadays, I think people in the field mostly agree that a better way to think about it is that you have these two traditions going along. In both of them are philosophical discussions and positions being defended. It's just that they're primarily responding on the one hand to the Islamic revelation and the other hand to the Greek tradition, right? And then they could see that the doctrines and arguments were clashing. And so one of the things that Ibn Sina was trying to do was sort out the differences between kalam and falsafa.
Mm-hmm. Right. And in the book, you also talk a little bit about a formative period characterized by a contest between Avicenna and Kalam. I mean, what is this formative period about and how did it play out?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've used the words formative period in different ways in different contexts. So sometimes I use that phrase to just mean the time up to Avicenna or Ibn Sina. Yeah. But here, I mean, we could also think about the kind of formative period of post-Avicennan philosophy. So what happens right after him. And here the main figure is probably al-Ghazali, who died in 1111. So again, Ibn Sina died 1037, so less than a century later. Mm-hmm. And Ghazali is a major theologian who writes a lot. And one of his most famous works is called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, Tahafud al-Falasifa. And that's a really good example of something I just mentioned, which is that the word philosophy or philosophers now means Ibn Sina and Avicenna philosophy. It doesn't mean Aristotle. So when he's attacking Ibn Sina, when he's attacking the philosophers, he's attacking Ibn Sina, not Aristotle anymore. Mm-hmm. So what he does is to go through a bunch of points in Ibn Sina's philosophy that he thinks are A, wrong, B, badly argued for by Ibn Sina, and C, have a problematic relationship to Islam. So, for example, notoriously, Ibn Sina thinks that the universe is eternal. So it is generated by God. God makes it exist, as I said before, but eternally. So there's no first moment in time for the universe. Whereas traditionally in Kalam, people had said that the world does begin in time. And Ghazali very strongly defends that position. That's one example. He also complains, for example, that Ibn Sina can't account for miracles. He challenges him on other points about how God relates to the universe and so on. So sometimes people think of Ghazali as the sort of anti-philosopher, but actually he's more like a philosophically minded theologian who's attacking certain ideas of Ibn Sina. So actually there's other ideas of Ibn Sina that he quite likes. For example, Ibn Sina's logic, he thinks is sort of fine. And in fact, he's quite satirical and dismissive about people who don't think logic is worthwhile. So he thinks, these people are idiots. They don't even do logic, right? So he's not by any means a kind of across-the-board anti-philosopher, but he's a critical respondent to Ibn Sina. And there's some other less famous people who do the same thing, like al-Shahrastani and Sharifuddin al-Masudi, who also write kind of critical responses to Ibn Sina around the same time. So there's a whole kind of wave of initial responses to Ibn Sina where they are criticizing him. But by the same token, there are also people starting with Ibn Sina's own students. For example, one of his main students is named Bahmanyar, and they write defenses of and kind of summaries of Ibn Sina's philosophy. Sometimes these are important because they present Ibn Sina's philosophy so nice and clearly and in fairly short space that people just respond to the students instead of reading Ibn Sina, right? But it's certainly like Avicennan philosophy, what they're doing. So you can see that already, even in the first generation or two after Ibn Sina, the battle lines are already being drawn. There's kind of pro-Ibn Sina and anti-Ibn Sina voices. And what's going to happen as we go forward is that people will increasingly sort of step back from this debate. So they think, okay, there's the kalam tradition, which has at first been very critical of Ibn Sina. There's this, what we're now calling falsafa, which is just Avicennan philosophy, which is inspired by Aristotle, but is kind of different and reworked. And they are passing judgment on that in some way. And then that would be sort of the next phase of development.
So how did you go about writing this book? Because taking into account the huge corpus of works from this period of time, which I wasn't really aware at all before listening to your podcast and reading your book, what methodology did you use?
Yeah, actually, so that's the first one. So there's going to be, and it's that big, right? So this is 800 something pages, I guess. No, sorry, 700 pages. But the second one, so this is volume 1, and it's on metaphysics and theology. The second volume is on logic and epistemology, and it's even longer. Mm-hmm. And the third one, I hope, will be done within a year or so and go to press then. And that's on physics and psychology. So how did we do this? Because as you can see, it was a lot of work. Yeah. So, I mean, part of the answer is we got a lot of funding from the German Research Council, the DFG, so Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, who supported the project by enabled me to hire several postdoctoral fellows. And for this first book, the postdoc relevant person was Fedor Benovich. And for the second book, it's him plus someone else named Dustin Klinger. And then for the third book, we have several people. So we have Michael Noble, we have Sarah Virgi, and Andreas Lammer. So these were all these postdocs who were working together with me. Mm-hmm. And their job was to go through this mountain of texts and find passages worth translating. So, I mean, you might think, okay, well, we just translated everything and that's why it's so long. But actually, to give you some sense of like how much material we're talking about, this is an extremely selective selection. Can I say that? So extremely selective choice of just individual passages from the works of a couple of dozen philosophers, some of whom each wrote numerous works. So, for example, one of the main philosophers who we quote from a lot, who I guess we'll probably get on to talking about, Fakhr al-Rāzī. Fakhr wrote like a shelf or two worth of stuff about philosophy. So if you translated everything that he wrote, it would be thousands of pages just for him. Maybe not thousands and thousands, but if you translated all his philosophical works, I'm confident that it would be a couple of thousand pages at least, just for one guy, right? So obviously we couldn't translate everything. So instead what we did was we kind of sat down and came up with a list of what we thought would be the most interesting topics. And each chapter in the book has the name of a philosophical topic, like, for example, proofs for God's existence, right? Mm-hmm. And then, so in this case, Fedor, the postdoctoral researcher, who, by the way, is now a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, he went through hundreds and hundreds of pages of material on proofs of God's existence, just kind of skimming them, really, because it's a lot of the material, they're responding to each other, they're quoting each other. So often you will read a page and you think, okay, I know what this is, so I can go on, right? And what he did was to find the most sort of interesting, philosophically interesting and original moves being made within this debate. He did a draft translation of the passages that he wanted to include. And then I went through and sort of adjusted the translations. And then my other job was to write an introduction for each chapter. And then he adjusted my introduction. So we kind of worked on each other's parts. Sometimes we decided to take passages out or put new passages in, but that's basically what we did. So this took like, the whole project took 6 years. So we have 6 years of research fellows sitting in the office next to me, plowing through all this Arabic textual evidence. Sometimes, by the way, we didn't have editions for the text, so they only had scans of manuscripts. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the works we were looking at are in Persian, but mostly it's Arabic. For one author, whose name is Bar Hebraeus, we even have text in Syriac, which is another Semitic language, which actually I can't read, but so a couple of my postdocs could read it. So, right. So after selecting all that, translating it, then I wrote the introductions, and that's really what the book is. Something else we did, by the way, is that I was able, also with support from the DFG, I was able to fund people who were typing up the original texts. So there's a website, if you just look for Heirs of Avicenna, I think it's heirsofAvicenna.net. You have all of the original texts in Arabic and Persian available as a free PDF. Oh, and by the way, the books are free too, because they're open access. So if you just go to the Brill website, you can download them for free. So everything's free.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, and how much of the original material has been preserved?
Preserved?
Yeah.
So you don't mean included in our books, actually?
No, but actually preserved, yes.
Well, that's hard to say because, I mean, way too much is the answer, I guess. I mean, much more than anyone could read. But I think that all of the major figures wrote lost works, I would say. Mm-hmm. But for many of these figures, we have a lot of their writings. And I mean, one thing is we're now getting to the 12th, 13th century, right? So we actually have manuscripts that are that old. So it's not like working on, so for example, al-Kindi, a philosopher I wrote one of my first books about, he's 9th century, and his works are mostly preserved only in a single manuscript. So we almost didn't have al-Kindi at all, right? And there are other philosophers around that period where we know, actually in his case, we know that he wrote many works that are not preserved. Whereas for someone like Fakhr, there are certainly lost works, but we have massive amounts of text for him. So, I mean, I can't give you a statistic about how much is lost because I don't think we don't know how long the works that weren't preserved are and so on. But I mean, as I say, we're talking about shelves and shelves worth of texts. Again, some of it's been edited in modern printed editions and a lot of it hasn't.
Mm-hmm. So since in this conversation we're going to focus mostly on the first volume, the one on metaphysics, I would like to ask you, how did Avicenna approach metaphysics? I mean, what counted as a subject matter of metaphysics and what did not count as such for Avicenna?
Right. That's actually the topic of the first chapter in the book, right? So, so that's actually turns out to be a surprisingly difficult or contested issue, because you might think, oh, well, metaphysics is just about whatever exists, right? That's what we think it is. But it's more complicated than that, because you actually sort of have two choices. And they stem from rival interpretations of Aristotle's metaphysics. So one idea is that Aristotle's metaphysics is just about being. So whatever is, right? And the different ways of being, that would be the topic of metaphysics. The other possibility is that metaphysics is in some sense a science which leads us to God. And you might think that because the 12th book of the Metaphysics in Aristotle is about God, and the last two books seem to be kind of on different issues. They seem like not part of the main project of the work. And so a lot of people throughout history, Thomas Aquinas, for example, have thought that the project of metaphysics as a science and the metaphysics by Aristotle is to begin with beings and substances around us in the world and kind of work our way up to an understanding of God. Okay. So, and for example, Ibn Rushd thinks something like this as well. So Averroes, the Spanish commentator I mentioned before, that's complicated. I wrote a paper about it a few years ago, but we don't need to go into that. So Ibn Sina apparently at first thought that the metaphysics and the work by Aristotle and the science of metaphysics should be about God. And then he read a very short little treatise by al-Farabi about the metaphysics by Aristotle, which said basically, don't be confused. God comes up, but it's really about being. It's a study of being. And that's what Ibn Sina thinks as well. So he thinks that it's a study, he wouldn't say being, he would say existence. So the Arabic word here is wujud. And it's the study, so for him, it's going to be the study of the existence as such, or of existence as such. And God comes into it because God is the cause of existence for everything else and is himself necessarily existent. So he doesn't have a cause. He must exist by his very nature. This is interesting because then you could think about, okay, well, does that mean that, well, like, what's the relationship between theology and metaphysics? So in Aristotle, theology would be this treatment of God inside the metaphysics, right? Mm-hmm. So you could think of theology as kind of part of metaphysics, maybe. It's the part of metaphysics that studies God. Or you could think of theology as some kind of parallel discipline, which is devoted entirely to God and maybe even incorporates some kind of information from revealed texts, right? So the people who are doing kalam, so what we translate as theology, they have to think about the relationship between what they're doing and metaphysics. And for the most part, they actually decide that what they are doing is in fact metaphysics and includes the study of God in very much the same way as Ibn Sina's metaphysics does.
By the way, when it comes to the philosophers from the Islamic East of this time period, the 12th and 13th centuries, were all of them religious or started from religious assumptions or not?
Yes. So they're not all Muslims, but they are all Jews, Muslims, or Christians. So that figure I mentioned a few minutes ago, Bahar Breas, who wrote in Syriac, he's Christian. So he's the main Christian that we're dealing with. One of the main philosophers from the 12th century, who we quote from a lot, is named al-Barakāt al-Baghdādī. So that means he's from Baghdad, right? So that's why he's called al-Baghdādī. And al-Barakāt was a Jewish Muslim convert. So he was Jewish and then converted to Islam towards the end of his life. But I guess apart from, and then there's also a later philosopher who we use a lot, Ibn Kamuna, who was also Jewish. But for the most part, we're dealing with Muslims. And right. Of course, there's no atheists, right? Because there's no atheists anywhere. I mean, atheism is not a thing until like 17th century France. So,
yeah. And I mean, this is a very broad question. You can tackle it whichever way you prefer. But what would you say are the issues that best characterize the metaphysical philosophy of the Islamic East in the 12th and 13th centuries? I mean, there are many topics that you explore in the book, like, for example, one you already mentioned, the distinction between essence and existence, but there's also the non-existent things and whether they are real or not, the problem of universals or the features that are or could be shared in common by many things, the Platonic forms, individuation, free will, and determinism. I mean, which are perhaps the main topics, or what characterizes mostly the philosophy, the metaphysical philosophy of this time period in the Islamic East?
I mean, I think so. Maybe there's actually, I would almost say that you can sort the topics of the chapters into two categories. Okay. So some of them are really about preoccupations of Muslim theologians, which they used Ibn Sina's philosophy to address. So there you've got things like free will or proofs of God's existence, right? So Avicenna has a proof of God's existence and they are very impressed by it. They critique it, but they are using it, right? And then they come up with other proofs. So that's kind of things that are appealing to them because they are mutakallimun, because they're theologians, most of them. And then there's this other kind of issue, which is just a kind of issue of pure metaphysics. And the same people are interested in that as well, right? So everyone's sort of doing some philosophy and some metaphysics, everyone's doing some metaphysics and some theology that we cover in this book, but some of them are thinking of themselves more as theologians, some of them are thinking of themselves as defenders of Ibn Sina, and some of them are thinking of themselves as just kind of independent thinkers who can decide what they should say. So al-Barakāt would be an example of that. But since you asked, like, what are the core areas of metaphysics, I think the really key thing is this issue about essence and existence. So again, the issue is something like this. Let's take me. So I'm a human. So a lot is implied by my being a human, right? So I have to be an animal because humans are a kind of animal. I must be rational in the sense of being capable of reasoning, because that's true of humans as such. I have to be alive. I have to have a body, right? Maybe even something like I can't be as tall as a skyscraper might be something that is true of me just in virtue of being a human. Okay, so lots of things are true of me just in virtue of being a human, but not my existence. So my existence seems to be something else, right? And because it's not explained by my being a human, Ibn Sina would say it has to have some other explanation, and the explanation would be my cause. So whatever caused me to exist is what gave my humanity this further feature, which is existence, right? Mm-hmm. Now, if you think about it in that way, then you're kind of imagining, well, I've kind of got this essence floating around, and then a cause sort of grabs it and sticks existence onto it, which is a very weird way to think about it, right? Like, what would this essence be? Humanity, if it doesn't exist, even, right? Mm-hmm. And that connects to a couple of issues we talk about in the book. One is the status of the non-existent object, which had already been a big debate in Kalam before Ibn Sina came along. This is one of the best illustrations of the fact that they were really philosophers as well as theologians. They have this huge debate even before Ibn Sina about the status of non-existent objects. And some of them say, well, they're kind of real, they just don't exist. Others say, no, they're only like possibilities contained within God's power. And different views about this, right? And what effectively happens is that the post-Avicennan debate leads to two different positions. One is a kind of realist position, according to which in me there's sort of two aspects, namely my essence and my existence, and they've somehow been fused together, right? Mm-hmm. So that would sort of like be the people who thought that essences are real, whether or not they exist, right? So you could say, well, humanity was already real before I existed, and then it came to exist as well. And so now in me, an existing human, I have my humanity and my existence as sort of two principles that have been connected together by a cause. And other people said, no, that's ridiculous. So they think that this distinction between essence and existence is just mental or conceptual. So they say, well, we in our minds can distinguish between my humanity and my existence, but out in the world, there's just me, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm a human, right? But humans aren't made of two different things, essence and existence. And they have arguments back and forth. So for example, the people who think that the distinction is conceptual will first of all say that it doesn't make any sense to think of an essence that has no existence, because it would be nothing, right? Something non-existent is nothing. But another argument they give is that if existence were added to essence, then the existence itself would also need to exist, right? Mm-hmm. So there's the essence, the existence of the essence. But what about if the existence is something real, then it also exists. So there's the existence of the existence. And that further existence also exists. So it has another existence. And so you get a regress, right? Like the existence of the existence of the existence of my existence, right? And that's absurd, they thought. So lots of technical arguments like this, but that's one of the main arguments that they have over. And you know, in some ways, they are here arguing over the best way to interpret Ibn Sina. Like what did he mean when he contrasted essence to existence? Sometimes they think they know what Ibn Sina thought, and then they disagree with him or they agree with him. But actually, it's not that clear even what Ibn Sina thought about this question. So there's a kind of exegetical issue as well as a philosophical issue.
Right. And what were some of the most disputed questions in regards to God?
Right. Okay. So one issue follows on immediately from what I just said, which is the status of God's existence. Mm-hmm. So some people, and Fakhr al-Rāzī would be an unusual example of this. So this is an unpopular opinion, but it's an important opinion because it's his opinion and he's maybe the most important figure of the 12th century. So he thinks that existence is the same regardless of what exists. So my existence is just like God's existence. It's just that the thing that exists is better in his case, right? And the difference between God and me is that God's essence implies his existence, whereas mine does not. So I need a cause to exist. He doesn't, right?
Right.
But the existence as such is just the same thing, right? It's the same phenomenon. It's just, you can maybe just say, well, for him, existence is just like being in the world. That's what existence is. Other people say no, because God relates so intimately to his existence that his existence has to be divine in some way, right? One way of thinking about this might be that God's essence just is to exist, and that's why he's a necessary existent. But if his existence just is the same as him, right, or the same as his essence, then obviously it's not something that I could have, right? Because then my existence would be God. That's obviously not true, right? So there's a debate between people who think that existence means the same thing for God and creatures, and people who, that's basically Fakhr who thinks that. And then there's other people who deny that and say, no, God has a special kind of exalted kind of existence. This is interesting, by the way, because it's a good example of something I mentioned earlier, namely that we get the same debates playing out in Latin medieval philosophy. So in late 13th century philosophy, so a whole century later, this whole debate is recapitulated by Aquinas and some other scholastics. So we have Duns Scotus occupying the same position that Fakhr was occupying. And we have Aquinas and Henry of Ghent and some other people defending the rival position that existence means something different in the two cases. So that's one big debate. Another big debate is whether he creates the world necessarily or not, as we talked about before. So that runs on from Ghazali. And a third big debate is whether, well, not whether you can prove that he exists, whether you can prove that God exists. They all think you can. The question is more how best to prove that God exists. So, for example, some of them think those two issues go together, because some of them think that the right way to prove God's existence is to show that the universe cannot have existed for an eternal period of time, right? So it came into existence with in some moments in the past, like, exactly 7 million years ago or something. And if that's true, then the world must have a cause, because it began to exist that needs an explanation, and that cause would be God, right? Whereas Ibn Sina and people who agree with him think that the universe is eternal, so they need some other way of proving that God exists. And Ibn Sina has a proof of God's existence, which they discuss in depth as well.
So at a certain point in the book, you use the term paraphilosopher and ask whether the philosophers from the Islamic East in this time period were philosophers or paraphilosophers. So what does that term mean, and how do you answer that question?
Yeah, I think we talk about this in the introduction. So this is a term that was proposed by Dimitri Gutas, who's one of the greatest living scholars of Islamic philosophy. And has done a lot of work on Ibn Sina himself, among other topics. So Professor Gutas thinks that this whole tradition that we're looking at is perhaps very complicated and intellectually sophisticated, and I guess he would probably even say it's very interesting, but he doesn't really think that it's philosophy in the proper sense. And the reason is that so many of them are doing philosophy in the context of some kind of theological project. So as I said, they are often people who would self-identify as mutakallimun, or even if they wouldn't, they are borrowing so much from kalam that they are clearly like within that tradition, okay? And they're obviously very convinced Muslims, as we already said, right? And so what Gutas would say is, well, that's not really philosophy, because philosophy would be something more like a disinterested search for truth, right? So I guess he would say that philosophers kind of start with a blank piece of paper, and probably they could never just literally not have any beliefs or commitments, but they would set them all aside and just follow reason wherever it leads. So, for example, they would only believe in God if you could prove God's existence, right? So what he would say is that these guys are all what he calls paraphilosophers. In other words, they're kind of pretending to do philosophy, but they're not really doing philosophy because they're not really engaged in a dispassionate, objective search for truth, which is what he thinks philosophy should be. Okay. So that's his idea. I mean, so something that we say in the introduction is, well, okay, but we're about to give you like 700 pages of extremely detailed, intricate philosophical argumentation. And I mean, I think sometimes I think that Professor Gutas and we are sort of talking about different things, because I think what he's talking about is something more like what was motivating them, or what did they think they were doing, right? So of course they didn't think they were doing falsafa, right? Because they use the word falsafa to mean Avicennan philosophy. So I mean, some of them are defending him, but most of them are criticizing him or using him to build systems of their own. So I guess he's really interested in maybe what you could call philosophy as like a cultural project. And that's not their project, he would say. He would say their project is a theological, religious project. I mean, so a good way of bringing out the difference between my way of thinking about this and his way of thinking about it is that in the introduction, we say, well, by his reasoning, Thomas Aquinas wasn't a philosopher either, nor were any of the famous Latin scholastic philosophers.
Right.
And that seems silly. And his response to that, he actually has a forthcoming paper in which he says, exactly, that's true. They weren't philosophers either. And I guess I kind of feel once you've argued yourself into the position of saying that Thomas Aquinas wasn't a philosopher, I sort of feel like the argument is over, actually. I mean, that just seems to me like a non-starter of something to say. So if you found yourself saying that, then you have to work your way back and figure out where the mistake was. I think you just sort of can't say that. That's ridiculous. But I can see what he means. So I think what he wants is philosophers who are so unencumbered by religious concerns that there almost haven't ever been any. So, for example, I don't think that by his standards, I don't think Descartes was a philosopher. And if you think Descartes not a philosopher, you're really in trouble, I would say. But I haven't asked him about that. I don't know what he would say about Descartes.
Right. So, I mean, among all of the philosophers that you cover in the book, in the Islamic East, what would you say, and in this particular time period, what would you say were the most prominent ones?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot of philosophers we cover. So most of the chapters quote from at least 15 people. And I think that across the whole book, we quote from several dozen people. So it's quite a large cast of characters. And in fact, one of the problems or one of the worries we had is that it might be kind of hard to follow what's going on. So, and in fact, we say this in the introduction, like these books are not the books that's going to tell you who these guys were and what their projects were. And Dimitri Gutas is right that that's not what we're doing. We're not trying to present the intellectual project of individual people and what was motivating them or something. We're following philosophical debates through. So, I mean, maybe you could say that we're approaching it in a very philosophical way and not a historical way, right? So I think insofar as that's what he wants, that would indeed be a different kind of study. A book like a recent book by Frank Griffel, The Formation of Post-Classical Philosophy, I think it's called. That's what he's doing. So he's trying to reconstruct Fakhruddin's project and like the difference between his different works and so on. And there's other people who have done that kind of work, like Ayman Shihadeh, who's also worked on Fakhruddin al-Rāzī, or Haydn Eichner, for example. But actually, in some ways, our feeling was, well, there's a lot of people thinking about that, like how the works are constructed, why were they written, when and where were they written. We wanted to focus just on the kind of philosophical meat, all the arguments. So, like I say, there's a lot of them. And the people that we sort of highlight as being the most important in the 12th century are three guys. And I've already mentioned two of them already. So Fakhruddin al-Rāzī, who I think is the kind of hero of the whole project. So he's quoted in every single chapter. Usually we quote from him more than anyone else. And he's quoted not just in the Metaphysics volume, but in the Logic and Epistemology volume. He's again quoted in every chapter prominently, and he'll be prominent in every chapter in the physics and psychology volume. So he's sort of like Ibn Sina, massively interesting all the time. So he's just a brilliant philosopher.
Right.
Okay, so there's him. And he's, by the way, kind of hard to classify. So people often think of him as a kind of theologian. He also wrote a very important and very huge commentary on the Quran, which suggests that he was a theologian. But he actually refers to kalam sometimes as if it was some other thing that he's not part of, right? So sometimes he'll say, like, there's my group, the people I follow, who are a certain group within kalam, but he'll also say, well, the mutakalimun say X, Y, and Z, and they're wrong, right? So his relationship both to Ibn Sina and to kalam is very independent-minded. He's actually a lot like Ibn Sina himself, in the sense that he's maybe trying to replace Ibn Sina the way that Ibn Sina replaced Aristotle. But he's not the only person doing that. So a little bit earlier, there's this guy, al-Barakāt al-Baghdādī, I mentioned, Jewish Muslim convert, like I said. Whereas Fakhr wrote books and books and books, a huge amount of output from Fakhr. al-Barakāt really only has this one book, although it's quite fat. It's like that wide in the Arabic edition. And it's called Kitab al-Mu'tabar, which means the book of the carefully considered, which kind of tells you what he's doing. Very similar to what I just said about Fakhr. He's judging which positions in the intellectual landscape are convincing and which are not. That he's also very influential. He's influential on Fakhr, among other people. His writing is very difficult and conceptually and linguistically difficult. One thing I sort of just anecdotally, when I was going through the translations that my colleagues had provided, I would always struggle to go through al-Barakāt's, like, very difficult texts, and then I would get to Fakhr and it would just fly through. So Fakhr writes super, super clear, beautiful, nice, clear Arabic, sort of like Aquinas in Latin, actually. And sometimes I think the one reason everyone wants to work on Fakhr now in my field, and one reason people work on Aquinas so much in Latin medieval philosophy, is that they just write very clear and very, like, nicely demarcated arguments and everything. Okay. The third guy then would be Suhrawardī, also a very difficult author, very hard to work through. And he's in some ways the most complicated because people have a very different idea about him than what we found when we actually read all of his books. So this is kind of a long story, but I'll try to make it short. So in later Iranian philosophy, and especially in the work of a 17th century philosopher from Iran named Mullah Sadra, Suhrawardī, this 12th century philosopher, is kind of held up as a really significant figure who initiates a whole new kind of philosophy, which is called illuminationism. So it's called Ishraqi philosophy. Mm-hmm. And it's thought to be kind of a new departure from previous philosophy that incorporates ideas from mysticism and maybe even older traditions like Persian philosophy and Persian religious ideas. And this would be this new illuminationist philosophy, which considers God to be a light who illuminates the world, and our souls are lights which descend from him, and so on and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. So that's mostly based on one of his works, maybe his most important work, which is called The Philosophy of Illumination, Hikmat al-Ishraq. So, okay, very interesting work. But we did find when we read a lot of his other works that they're very much like other things that were being written at the time, like by Fakhr. And in that context, we're not saying that he's not innovative or interesting. We do think he's very interesting and innovative, but we kind of came away from it thinking that he's a lot like al-Barakāt and Fakhr. In other words, he's a very careful reader of Ibn Sina, who is criticizing a lot of the philosophical moves made in Ibn Sina and wants to kind of create his own philosophical system. And then in Hikmat al-Ishraq, he comes up with this illuminationist terminology to kind of describe what he's doing. But fundamentally, he fits pretty well into the 12th century scene, I think. So that's the 12th century. And then 13th century, just briefly, I think two of the main guys would be, first of all, Nasir ad-Din al-Ṭūsī, Ṭūsī is someone who survived the Mongol invasions and actually wound up working for the Mongols and running an astronomical observatory in a place called Maraga in modern day Iran. And he had a whole circle of philosophers around him and scientists. So he was an astronomer and kind of all-around intellectual. And he was a defender of Ibn Sina. So what you often have is Fakhr will attack Ibn Sina and Ṭūsī will defend him. So in fact, they both wrote commentaries on the same work by Ibn Sina. And Fakhr's commentary is just a list of criticisms. And Ṭūsī is a point-by-point refutation of the criticisms. That's what he's doing in his commentary. Someone else who's maybe worth mentioning from the 13th century is named Hunaji. And he's not so important in this volume, but he's the main figure in the logic volume, or at least in the logic parts of the next volume, because he's the most innovative logician of the whole period, actually. So he's really important for the history of logic, but not so important for the history of metaphysics.
Okay, so I mean, I have one or two more broad questions to ask you before we wrap up our conversation. So we are talking here about the Heirs of Avicenna. Is there also a legacy to these philosophers from the Islamic East and from the 12th and 13th centuries? I mean, if not on a global level, let's say like many of the Western philosophers have nowadays, at least in the Islamic world, or not?
Yeah. So actually, one interesting question that we haven't really addressed yet is, hang on a second, if there's thousands and thousands of pages of extremely technical advanced philosophy in the 12th and 13th century, why didn't people already kind of know about this, right? And the answer is that they did, especially in the Islamic world. Like, scholars have been working on this for decades, right? But it hadn't really been integrated into history of philosophy in Western languages until recently. So we weren't the first people to do this. I mean, we were inspired by the work of some of the people I mentioned before, like Gutas and Eichner and Shehadeh and Griffel. But the reason we did this is we just thought it was too hard for people to access, because masses and masses of text, no translations, a lot of it's, as I said, not even edited. So very, very hard to get at. And that's why we not only translated the material, but also typed up the Arabic and Persian to give people access to that. I think also even people in the Islamic world, or like native Arabic speakers, they might not need our translations, but it would be very useful for them to have the texts that we translated, right? Because it's very hard to assemble all that material and find it. Okay. So the reason why this stuff hadn't been considered very much in mainstream history of philosophy in European languages is that it had no impact on the Latin medieval tradition or the Renaissance, right? So the Latin, there's an Arabic, there's a translation movement of philosophical text from Arabic into Latin, and it happens around the end of the 12th century, but in the West, so in like Sicily and Spain. So they don't have these texts. They're either too late or too far east at that time. So someone like Fakhr al-Rāzī or al-Suhrawardī, despite being very, very interesting, is not known to a figure like Aquinas, but Aquinas does have Heirs of Avicenna because they're included in the translation movement. Yeah. So you kind of have a point at which the two traditions have something in common, and that would be really up to the time of Ibn Sina, and then they branch apart. But the philosophers we're talking about here were very well known in the Islamic world. So if we go up to, like, let's say the 16th, 17th century, so once you get into the time of the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Empire down in India, their works are known. Hunaji, or there's another logician named Najm ad-Din al-Katibi, who wrote a really influential logical textbook, and his logic was still, so he's 13th century, right? His logical textbook was still being used to teach logic in Cairo in the early 20th century, so only 100 years ago. And the logical tradition that like ultimately goes back to Ibn Sina through people like Hunaji was still being practiced in, for example, India at the turn of the 20th century. So actually it is a global phenomenon. It's just that it's a different part of the globe. It's the part that goes from basically West Africa, North Africa, all the way over to Central Asia, right? That's what the influence of this material that we've been looking at. And if you said Fakhr al-Rāzī to any Muslim intellectual of the 18th century, so that's 500 years after Rāzī, right? They would know who that was. And they would even probably have read him, I guess.
Yeah. So one last question then. By studying the philosophy created by these Islamic thinkers and other thinkers outside of Europe, actually, as you do, for example, in your podcast, History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, how do you look at the Eurocentric approach that dominates or tends to dominate philosophy worldwide? I mean, do you think it is an impoverished approach?
I mean, yes. Although, I mean, I think so in a sense, you might say, well, this is just obviously ridiculous to restrict the study of philosophy to European philosophy, right? Because there's all this other philosophies, and why would you do that? And it's not just Islamic philosophy, right? So you've got Chinese philosophy, you've got Indian philosophy, you've got African philosophy, you've got Latin American philosophy. Earlier than that, you've got Mesoamerican cultures, which had philosophical material that are available. You could even think about, indigenous philosophical ideas, Native Americans, indigenous Australians, prehistoric Africa, that we can access through ethnography and archaeology and so on. So we've covered a lot of that, especially in the Africana series, we covered that. And I mean, to some extent, I think the answer to the question is just, well, if it's there, then why wouldn't you study it? It's just all part of the history of philosophy. Maybe there is some kind of feeling that the philosophy from these other cultures, okay, maybe it's philosophy, but maybe it's not as advanced or interesting or something like that as the philosophy that we have from like Leibniz and Descartes and Kant, right? Or even Plato and Aristotle. So I think maybe a lot of people who want to cling to this Eurocentric approach, they might not, now it's getting hard to say this out loud, right? But they might still think in the back of their mind, or maybe even not consciously, they might be thinking, okay, yes, I know that there was Confucius and Avicenna or whatever, but the really good philosophy has always been European, right? So one of the things that you can do with a project like this is just show that's not true. So we are presenting philosophy here that's every bit as advanced, technical, sophisticated as, for example, Latin medieval philosophy, right? And it's engaging with a tradition of philosophy that goes back through Avicenna to Aristotle. So it's even part of the same story, right? It's just a part that kind of diverged, right? And I think that's actually an interesting thing to consider. So you also have extremely sophisticated technical philosophy in classical India, for example. So the Nyaya logical school in India is doing things that you could compare with what these guys are doing in logic, right? It's sophisticated, technical, etc. But it has nothing to do with Greek logic, right? It's a completely independent phenomenon. And that's interesting too. So the Islamic philosophy in general, and this tradition within it is in particular, these are interesting to think about because they are kind of part of global philosophy, but they're not unconnected to European philosophy because they both stem from the original Greek tradition, albeit via Avicenna. And they also, to some extent, feed back into European philosophy. Not these guys, but someone like Avicenna was being read all the time in the schools and universities of 13th and 14th century Europe.
Right. So, I mean, just before we go, again, the book is Heirs of Avicenna, Philosophy in the Islamic East, 12th and 13th centuries. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. But when should people expect to have access to the third volume on psychology and physics?
So the first, I think it looks like they're going to come out every 2 years. So the Metaphysics one came out, I guess, in 2023. Logic and Epistemology came out in 2025 just now. And so I think we're aiming for the next one to come out in 2027. Let's hope so.
Yeah. So,
but it's going to be really long, so wish me luck. Wish us luck.
Yeah, of course. So apart from that and your podcast, which I've already mentioned in the introduction, where else can people find you and your work on the internet?
Okay. Well, so I work at Munich, at the LMU in Munich. So if you go to the page of my chair, my philosophy chair, you can see what we're up to here. We have other research projects at the moment. So now we're working on another group of philosophers who worked earlier in the Islamic world. So actually a bunch of Christian philosophers who were working on Aristotle in Baghdad in the 10th century. So that's the next big project we're doing here. But I think the main way to keep up with what I'm doing is to just go to my podcast website, which is www.historyofphilosophy.net, because I also have a blog there where I talk about what I'm up to.
Great. So, Dr. Adamson, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show again. It's been really fun to talk with you.
Likewise. Thanks again.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Mark Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.